Detective Jake Williams never thought his quiet suburban life would become a battlefield. For 15 years, he'd worked for the FBI, solving cases that most people only saw in movies. But when he came home to Maple Ridge Community, he was just another neighbor who liked to keep his lawn neat and his life private. Jake lived in a beautiful house on Elm Street, where every yard looked perfect and the streets were always clean. The Homeowners Association made sure everything stayed that way. They had rules about grass height, fence colors, and even what kind of flowers you could plant. Most neighbors didn't mind. They liked living somewhere that looked nice and kept property values high. The community had everything a family could want. There was a sparkling swimming pool, a playground for kids, walking trails that wound through small patches of woods, and a clubhouse where people held birthday parties and community meetings. Security guards patrolled the area day and night, making everyone feel safe. At least that's what the brochures promised when Jake first moved in. Jake's 12-year-old niece, Lucy, had been staying with him for the summer while her parents worked overseas. Her mom was a nurse helping set up medical clinics in rural areas, and her dad was an engineer building water systems in places that needed clean drinking water. They did important work, but it meant Lucy spent her summers with Uncle Jake. Lucy was the kind of kid who made friends easily. She had curly brown hair that bounced when she walked, and she was always smiling about something. The neighborhood kids loved her because she knew how to make even boring summer days feel like adventures. She could turn a walk to the mailbox into a treasure hunt, or convince a group of kids that the community pool was actually a secret lagoon. During her stay, Lucy had become the unofficial leader of the neighborhood kids. Every morning, she'd grab her bright red bike and ride around the community, picking up friends for whatever adventure she'd planned that day. Sometimes they'd have bike races around the parking lot. Other times they'd explore the walking trails looking for interesting rocks or trying to spot birds. The Homeowners Association had always seemed reasonable to Jake. They sent monthly newsletters about community events, reminded people about pool rules, and handled maintenance issues quickly. The HOA president, Mrs. Patterson, was a retired teacher who seemed to genuinely care about making the neighborhood a great place to live. She organized movie nights by the pool and holiday decorating contests that brought everyone together. But recently, things had started to change. The HOA had hired a new security company called Guardian Protection Services. They promised enhanced community safety and proactive security measures. The old security guards had been friendly people who knew everyone's names and would chat with kids riding their bikes. They made people feel safe without making anyone feel watched or worried. The new security team was different. They drove around in official-looking cars with bright lights and wore uniforms that looked more like police gear than regular security clothes. The guards carried tasers, handcuffs, and radios that crackled constantly with official-sounding chatter. They took their job very seriously, maybe too seriously for a quiet suburban neighborhood. Jake had noticed the change but hadn't thought much about it. His FBI training taught him to observe details that others might miss, but he was trying to keep his work life separate from his home life. He'd seen enough serious crime during his career. At home, he wanted to focus on normal things like helping Lucy with summer reading assignments and teaching her how to ride her bike without using her hands. The head of the new security team was a man named Officer Dale Brennan. He was in his late 30s with a military-style haircut and a way of standing that made him look like he was always ready for trouble. Brennan had worked in mall security and private event protection before joining Guardian Protection Services. He took pride in maintaining order and following rules exactly as they were written. Brennan had strong opinions about how a community should be run. He believed that small problems could quickly become big problems if people didn't take security seriously. A kid riding a bike too fast today could become a teenager causing real trouble tomorrow. A neighbor who didn't follow one rule might start ignoring other rules too. In his mind, consistency and firmness were the keys to keeping everyone safe. Jake had only spoken to Brennan once during a brief conversation at the mailbox. Brennan had mentioned seeing Lucy riding her bike around the community and suggested that children should always be supervised when using recreational equipment. Jake had nodded politely but thought the comment was unnecessary. Lucy was a responsible kid who knew how to stay safe. Most of the neighborhood families got along well with each other. Kids played together while parents chatted about work, weekend plans, and local schools. During evening walks, people stopped to talk about their gardens, upcoming vacations, or community events. It was the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other and kids could grow up feeling secure. Lucy had made friends with kids from several families. There was Tommy, whose dad coached Little League baseball, Maria, whose mom made the best cookies in the neighborhood and always shared them, and Kevin, who knew everything about every type of bird that lived in the community's trees. Together, they'd created their own little world within the larger community. The kids had their own understanding of the neighborhood rules. They knew not to ride bikes in the pool area. They understood that the flower beds were for looking, not touching. They knew to clean up after themselves at the playground and to be quiet near houses during afternoon nap times. Lucy was especially good at making sure everyone followed the rules because she didn't want to cause any trouble for Uncle Jake. Jake appreciated how well Lucy fit into the community. After 15 years of dealing with serious crimes and dangerous situations, it was refreshing to come home to a place where the biggest concern was whether someone's grass was getting too long. He looked forward to summer evenings when he could sit on his porch, watch Lucy play with her friends, and feel like a normal person living a normal life. But normal was about to become a memory. Changes were happening in the community that would test everything Jake thought he knew about fairness, justice, and protecting the people you love. The quiet suburban life he'd worked so hard to build was about to collide with the harsh realities he'd spent his career fighting against. Security cameras had been installed throughout the community, watching every corner and recording every interaction. New rules had been added to the HOA handbook, giving security officers broader authority to maintain order. Neighbors were being encouraged to report any behavior that seemed unusual or problematic. Jake's FBI training had taught him to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. Lately, those instincts were telling him that the peaceful community he'd chosen for his family was becoming something else entirely. He just didn't know how quickly that change would affect his own life, or how dramatically it would test his ability to protect the person who mattered most to him. Tuesday started like any other summer day in Maple Ridge community. The morning sun painted the sidewalks golden, and a gentle breeze made the heat bearable. Lucy had finished her breakfast and was eager to meet her friends at the community pool. She'd promised to bring her new pool games, and the kids were planning to spend the whole afternoon swimming and playing. Jake was getting ready for work when Lucy grabbed her bright red bike from the garage. She was wearing her favorite purple swimsuit under a t-shirt and shorts with her pool bag slung across her shoulder. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she had that excited energy that only kids get when they're looking forward to a perfect day. "Be careful and remember the pool rules," Jake called out as Lucy pedaled down the driveway. She waved back with a big smile, already thinking about which pool game to play first. The community pool was just a few blocks away, an easy bike ride through the safe, quiet streets she knew so well. Lucy loved riding her bike through the neighborhood. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every interesting garden, and every house where friendly neighbors might wave from their windows. Today, she took her usual route past the Johnsons' house with their beautiful rose garden, around the corner by the Martinez family's home where their dog always barked hello, and down the main street toward the pool area. The community pool was the heart of summer activity in Maple Ridge. It had a large swimming area, a smaller pool for little kids, comfortable lounge chairs, and plenty of shade under colorful umbrellas. During busy afternoons, the pool deck would be full of families enjoying the water and sunshine. Kids would play games while parents relaxed nearby, and everyone felt safe and happy. As Lucy rode her bike along the sidewalk that bordered the pool area, she could see other kids already arriving for their day of swimming. She was thinking about where to park her bike when a loud voice cut through the peaceful morning air. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Lucy looked around, confused. A man in a security uniform was walking quickly toward her, his hand resting on his equipment belt. She recognized him as Officer Brennan, the new security guard she'd seen patrolling the neighborhood. His face looked angry, and his voice had a sharp edge that made Lucy's stomach feel tight. Lucy stopped her bike and put one foot on the ground, the way her Uncle Jake had taught her. She wasn't sure what she'd done wrong. She was on the sidewalk wearing her helmet and heading to the pool just like she did every other day. Maybe Officer Brennan needed to tell her something important about pool safety. "What are you doing here?" Brennan demanded, stepping closer to Lucy. His uniform made him look much bigger than he actually was, and his serious expression made Lucy feel small and worried. "I'm going to the pool," Lucy answered politely. "My friends are waiting for me." She tried to smile, hoping that would help Officer Brennan understand that she wasn't causing any trouble. "Do you live in this community?" Brennan asked, pulling out a small notebook and pen. He was looking at Lucy like she was a problem that needed to be solved, not a kid who belonged in the neighborhood. Lucy nodded quickly. Yes, sir. I live with my Uncle Jake on Elm Street. House number 247. She'd been taught to be respectful to adults and to answer questions clearly when asked. Brennan wrote something in his notebook, then looked back at Lucy with suspicion. I haven't seen you around here before. How do I know you're telling the truth? I've been staying here all summer, Lucy explained, starting to feel scared. I can call my uncle if you want. He works for the government. She didn't understand why Officer Brennan was being so unfriendly. All the other adults in the neighborhood knew her and always smiled when they saw her. Government, huh? Brennan said with a sneer. That doesn't mean anything to me. What I see is a kid loitering in a private community area without proper supervision. Lucy didn't know what loitering meant, but it sounded bad. I'm not doing anything wrong, she said, her voice getting smaller. I'm just going to meet my friends at the pool. Other kids and parents were starting to notice the confrontation. Maria's mom was setting up her family's spot by the pool and looked over with concern. Tommy had just arrived with his little sister and was watching from the pool gate. The adults could see that something was wrong, but they weren't sure if they should get involved. Community rules state that children must be accompanied by an adult guardian at all times, Brennan announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. You're in violation of community safety protocols. Lucy's eyes filled with tears. She'd never been in trouble before, and she didn't understand what she'd done wrong. But I come to the pool by myself all the time, she said. My uncle says it's okay. All the kids do it. Well, your uncle is wrong, Brennan snapped, and I'm the one who enforces the rules around here. You need to leave immediately. By now, several neighbors had stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Chen was watering her garden nearby and had put down her hose to listen. Mr. Thompson was walking his dog and had paused on the sidewalk. Everyone could see that Lucy was just a kid trying to enjoy her summer, and most of them recognized her as Jake's niece. Please, Lucy said, tears now running down her cheeks. I just want to swim with my friends. I'm not causing any trouble. Brennan's face grew red with anger. He wasn't used to having his authority questioned, especially not by a child. In his mind, Lucy's refusal to leave immediately was a direct challenge to his position in the community's security. You're being non-compliant with lawful orders, Brennan shouted, his hand moving to his equipment belt. Last warning, leave now or face the consequences. Lucy was frozen with fear. She'd never had an adult yell at her like this before. She didn't know what non-compliant meant, and she didn't understand what consequences Officer Brennan was talking about. All she wanted was to ride her bike home and hide in her room until Uncle Jake came back from work. What happened next would haunt the Maple Ridge community forever. Without any additional warning, without calling for backup, and without considering that he was dealing with a frightened 12-year-old girl, Officer Brennan made a decision that would change everything. He pulled his taser from his belt, aimed it at Lucy and fired. The electrical charge hit Lucy in the shoulder, sending 50,000 volts of electricity through her small body. She screamed and fell off her bike, hitting the concrete sidewalk hard. Her body convulsed as the electrical current coursed through her, and then she lay still, crying and shaking. The watching neighbors were shocked into silence for a moment, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. Then chaos erupted. Maria's mom ran toward Lucy, her phone already in her hand to call 911. Tommy's dad started shouting at Brennan, demanding to know why he'd attacked a child. Mrs. Chen was crying and trying to comfort Lucy from a distance. Lucy lay on the sidewalk next to her overturned bike, her purple pool bag scattered beside her. The games she'd brought for her friends were spread across the concrete. She was conscious but shaking, with visible burn marks on her shoulder where the taser had made contact. The smell of singed fabric filled the air. Brennan stood over Lucy, his taser still in his hand, trying to justify what he'd just done to the growing crowd of angry neighbors. But there was no justification for what everyone had witnessed. A security officer had just used a dangerous weapon on a 12-year-old girl, whose only crime was wanting to go swimming with her friends. Jake was reviewing case files at the federal building when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Mrs. Chen from his neighborhood, which was unusual. She'd never called him before, and something about getting a call from a neighbor during work hours made his stomach drop. Jake, Mrs. Chen's voice was shaking. You need to come home right now. Something terrible has happened to Lucy. Time seemed to slow down as Jake tried to process what he was hearing. What do you mean? What happened? Is she okay? The security guard. He used a taser on her. She's hurt, Jake. The ambulance is here and they're taking her to Memorial Hospital. Jake's FBI training kicked in, forcing him to stay calm and get the information he needed. Which security guard? Why would he tase a child? Officer Brennan. Lucy was just riding her bike to the pool and he accused her of loitering. When she tried to explain that she lives here, he got angry and… Mrs. Chen's voice broke. Jake, she's just a baby. How could someone do this to a little girl? Jake was already grabbing his jacket and car keys. I'm on my way to the hospital. Can you tell me exactly what happened? As Mrs. Chen described the incident, Jake felt a cold rage building in his chest. 15 years in law enforcement had taught him to control his emotions, but this was different. This wasn't just another case. This was Lucy. This was family. The drive to Memorial Hospital felt like the longest 20 minutes of Jake's life. He kept thinking about Lucy's smile that morning, how excited she'd been about spending the day at the pool with her friends. Now she was in an ambulance because some power-hungry security guard had decided that a 12-year-old girl was a threat. When Jake arrived at the emergency room, he found Mrs. Chen and several other neighbors in the waiting area. Maria's mom was there with red eyes from crying. Tommy's dad was pacing angrily, still furious about what he'd witnessed. Everyone started talking at once when they saw Jake, trying to explain what had happened. Where is she? Jake asked, cutting through their voices. They took her back for tests, Mrs. Chen said. The paramedics said she was conscious but shaking really badly. They wanted to make sure the electrical shock didn't damage her heart or nervous system. Jake approached the reception desk, showed his identification, and explained that he was Lucy's guardian. The nurse looked sympathetic as she checked her computer system. The doctor will want to speak with you, she said. They're running some tests right now, but you can see her as soon as they're finished. While Jake waited, neighbors continued to arrive at the hospital. Word was spreading quickly through Maple Ridge community about what Officer Brennan had done. People were shocked, angry, and scared. If a security guard could tase a child for riding her bike, what might happen to their own kids? Dr. Patricia Hayes came out to speak with Jake about 40 minutes after he arrived. She was a pediatric emergency physician who'd seen many difficult cases. But her expression told Jake that this situation had affected her deeply. Lucy is stable, Dr. Hayes said, leading Jake to a quiet corner of the waiting room. But I need to explain what we're dealing with here. Tasers deliver 50,000 volts of electricity. That's dangerous for any person, but it's especially dangerous for children. Jake listened carefully as the doctor explained Lucy's injuries. The taser had left burn marks on her shoulder where the probes made contact. The electrical shock had caused her muscles to contract violently, and she'd hit the concrete hard when she fell. She had scrapes and bruises from the fall, but more concerning were the potential invisible injuries. Electrical shock can affect the heart rhythm, even hours after the incident, Dr. Hayes continued. We're monitoring her cardiac function closely. The nervous system can also be affected. Some people experience memory problems, confusion, or difficulty concentrating after being tased. Can I see her? Jake asked. Of course. But I should prepare you. She's pretty shaken up emotionally. She keeps asking if she's in trouble, if she did something wrong. She's having trouble understanding why an adult would hurt her like this. Jake followed Dr. Hayes down a long hallway to Lucy's room. When he saw her lying in the hospital bed looking so small under the white sheets, his heart broke. She had bandages on her shoulder, a heart monitor attached to her chest, and IV fluids running into her arm. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked frightened and confused. Uncle Jake, Lucy said when she saw him trying to sit up. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just going to the pool. Jake sat down beside her bed and took her hand gently. I know, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault. But Officer Brennan said I was breaking the rules. He said I was… What was that word? Loitering? I don't even know what that means. Jake had to work hard to keep his voice calm and reassuring. Inside he was furious, but Lucy needed him to be strong and steady right now. Loitering means hanging around somewhere you're not supposed to be. But you live in our neighborhood, Lucy. You belong there. My shoulder really hurts, Lucy said quietly, and I keep seeing flashes of light when I close my eyes. Dr. Hayes says that's normal, but it's scary. Jake spent the next several hours with Lucy as doctors ran various tests to make sure the electrical shock hadn't caused any serious internal damage. Each test came back showing that she was physically stable, but Jake could see the emotional trauma in her eyes. Lucy had always been a confident, happy kid who trusted adults and felt safe in the world. That trust had been shattered in a few terrible seconds. As evening approached, Dr. Hayes told Jake that Lucy could go home, but she would need to be monitored closely for the next few days. Any changes in her heart rhythm, breathing, or mental state should be reported immediately. They also recommended that Lucy speak with a counselor to help her process the trauma of what had happened. Has anyone from the community or the security company contacted you about this incident? Dr. Hayes asked Jake privately. Not yet, Jake said. But they will. Dr. Hayes looked troubled. I've been a pediatric emergency physician for 12 years. I've never seen a case where security personnel used a taser on a child. This should never have happened. As Jake helped Lucy get ready to leave the hospital, his neighbors continued to show their support. Mrs. Chen had brought Lucy's favorite stuffed animal from home. Tommy's mom had made Lucy's favorite cookies. Maria's dad had collected Lucy's scattered pool games from the sidewalk where she'd fallen. But Jake knew that community support, while meaningful, wouldn't be enough. Officer Brennan had committed a serious crime against a child, and the system that employed him had failed catastrophically. Someone needed to be held accountable, and Jake was determined to make sure that happened. As they drove home from the hospital, Lucy was quiet, staring out the window at the neighborhood that no longer felt safe to her. "Uncle Jake?" she said softly as they pulled into their driveway. "What is it, sweetheart? Am I going to get in trouble for what happened today?" Jake turned off the car and looked at his niece, really looked at her. She was 12 years old. She'd been excited about swimming with her friends. She'd done nothing wrong, and now she was asking if she was going to be punished for being attacked by an adult who was supposed to protect the community. "No, Lucy," Jake said firmly. "You're not going to get in trouble, but Officer Brennan is. I'm going to make sure of that." Jake barely slept that first night after bringing Lucy home from the hospital. Every few hours he checked on her to make sure she was breathing normally, and her heart rhythm seemed steady. Lucy had nightmares and woke up crying twice, calling out for help and saying she was sorry for something she hadn't done. By morning, Jake had made a decision. He wasn't just going to file a complaint and hope someone else would handle this properly. He was going to investigate this case himself, using every skill he'd learned in 15 years of federal law enforcement. Officer Brennan had made a terrible mistake when he chose to attack Jake's niece, because he'd just declared war on someone who knew exactly how to fight back. Jake started by securing the evidence. He drove to the spot where Lucy had been attacked and took detailed photographs of the sidewalk, including the scuff marks from where her bike had fallen and the small blood stain where she'd scraped her elbow. He measured distances and documented sight lines, creating a complete picture of the scene. Next, Jake began interviewing witnesses. Mrs. Chen had seen the entire incident from her front yard and was eager to tell her story. She described how Officer Brennan had approached Lucy aggressively from the beginning, how he'd escalated the situation unnecessarily, and how he'd shown no concern for Lucy's safety after tasing her. "That poor child was so confused," Mrs. Chen said, shaking her head. She kept trying to explain that she lived here, but he wouldn't listen. He seemed angry that she was even talking to him. Tommy's dad, Mike Rodriguez, had witnessed the incident while walking with his children to the pool. "It was completely unprovoked," Mike told Jake. "Lucy was just sitting on her bike trying to answer his questions. When he pulled out that taser, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Who attacks a kid like that?" Maria's mom, Elena Santos, had been setting up her family's pool area when she heard the commotion. Lucy was crying and trying to be polite, Elena explained. She called him sir and everything. She was being more respectful than most adults would be in that situation. As Jake interviewed more neighbors, a disturbing pattern emerged. Several people mentioned that Officer Brennan had been increasingly aggressive in recent weeks. He'd confronted teenagers for walking too slowly, questioned elderly residents about their right to use community facilities, and generally treated everyone like they were potential criminals. Jake's biggest breakthrough came when he spoke with David Park, a tech-savvy neighbor who had recently installed a high-definition security camera system around his property. David's doorbell camera had captured the entire incident in crystal-clear detail, including audio. "I was going to give this to the police anyway," David said, handing Jake a USB drive with the video file. but I wanted you to see it first. It's pretty hard to watch." Jake viewed the footage on his laptop, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The video clearly showed Lucy riding her bike normally on the public sidewalk. Officer Brennan approached her in an aggressive manner, immediately putting her on the defensive. The audio captured Lucy's polite responses and growing fear as Brennan escalated the confrontation. Most damning was what happened at the end. The video showed that Lucy was not threatening Brennan in any way when he deployed his taser. She was standing beside her bike, crying, and clearly trying to comply with his demands to leave. There was absolutely no justification for using force against her. Armed with witness statements and video evidence, Jake began researching Officer Brennan's background and the policies of Guardian Protection Services. What he discovered shocked him, even with his experience in law enforcement. Guardian Protection Services had a history of hiring security officers with questionable backgrounds. Officer Brennan had been fired from 2 previous security jobs for excessive force incidents. In one case, he'd physically restrained an elderly shopper at a mall for allegedly shoplifting, causing injuries that required medical treatment. The charges against the shopper were later dropped when security footage showed he'd done nothing wrong. Jake also discovered that Guardian Protection Services had been sued 3 times in the past 2 years for inappropriate use of force by their officers. In each case, the company had settled out of court and required the victims to sign non-disclosure agreements. The HOA board had hired this company despite having access to this information. Even more troubling was what Jake learned about the HOA's response to previous complaints about Officer Brennan. Mrs. Patterson, the HOA president, had received at least 4 written complaints about Brennan's aggressive behavior in the 6 weeks since he'd started working in the community. Instead of investigating these complaints or restricting Brennan's authority, the HOA board had simply filed them away. Jake found records showing that Brennan had confronted the Johnsons' 16-year-old son for skateboarding in an empty parking lot, accused Mrs. Martinez's elderly mother of trespassing when she visited from out of state, and questioned several other children about their right to play in community areas. Each incident showed a pattern of unnecessary aggression and poor judgment. The most disturbing discovery came when Jake interviewed Jennifer Walsh, a single mother whose 8-year-old son had been intimidated by Officer Brennan just 2 weeks before Lucy's attack. Brennan had accused the boy of vandalism when he drew pictures with sidewalk chalk in front of his own house. "He made my son empty his pockets and demanded to see identification," Jennifer told Jake. "My kid is 8 years old. When I complained to the HOA, they said Officer Brennan was just being thorough in his security duties." Jake realized that Lucy's attack wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was the predictable result of a dangerous pattern that the HOA had ignored. Multiple people had tried to warn the community leadership that Brennan was unsuitable for his position, but their concerns had been dismissed. As Jake compiled his evidence, he also researched the legal standards for security officers in their state. He discovered that private security personnel were required to complete specific training courses before being authorized to carry tasers. When Jake requested Brennan's training records through a public information request, he found that Brennan had never completed the required taser certification course. This meant that not only had Brennan used excessive force against a child, but he'd done so with a weapon he wasn't legally qualified to carry. Guardian Protection Services had equipped him with a taser without ensuring he had proper training, and the HOA had allowed an unqualified security officer to patrol their community. Jake also learned about the medical dangers of using tasers on children. Multiple studies showed that electrical weapons posed serious risks to young people, including potential cardiac problems and nervous system damage. Professional law enforcement agencies had strict policies limiting taser use on juveniles, but Guardian Protection Services apparently had no such restrictions. By the end of his first week of investigation, Jake had assembled a comprehensive case file that would have impressed his FBI colleagues. He had witness statements, video evidence, medical records, background information on the perpetrator, and documentation of the institutional failures that had made Lucy's attack possible. But Jake wasn't finished. He'd uncovered evidence of a systematic problem that went far beyond one security guard's poor judgment. The HOA board, Guardian Protection Services, and possibly other parties had created an environment where a child could be attacked with an electrical weapon for the crime of riding her bike to a swimming pool. As Jake organized his evidence and planned his next steps, Lucy was slowly beginning to heal. She was sleeping better and had even smiled a few times, though she still flinched when she heard loud voices. The physical wounds were healing, but Jake knew the emotional scars would take much longer to fade. That night, as Jake sat in his office reviewing the case file he'd built, he made a promise to himself and to Lucy. Everyone responsible for this attack was going to face the consequences of their actions. Justice would be served, not just for Lucy, but for all the children in the community who deserved to feel safe in their own neighborhood. Jake thought that having solid evidence would make the legal process straightforward. He was wrong. What he discovered over the next few weeks was that the system designed to protect children like Lucy was actually rigged to protect institutions like the HOA and Guardian Protection Services. The first shock came when Jake tried to file criminal charges against Officer Brennan. District Attorney Patricia Wells seemed reluctant to pursue the case aggressively. During their initial meeting, she kept emphasizing how difficult it would be to prove criminal intent. Security officers have broad discretion in protecting communities, DA Wells explained. Officer Brennan will argue that he perceived a threat and responded according to his training. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. He tased a 12-year-old girl who was riding her bike to a swimming pool. What possible threat could she have posed? "I understand your frustration," Wells said, not making eye contact. "But we have to consider how this will look to a jury. Brennan's defense attorney will paint him as a dedicated security professional trying to maintain community safety." Jake left the DA's office feeling like he'd entered an alternate reality where attacking children was somehow defensible. He didn't know yet that DA Wells had received significant campaign contributions from Steinberg and Associates, the law firm that represented Guardian Protection Services. Filing the civil lawsuit proved equally frustrating. Jake hired Rebecca Thompson, one of the best personal injury attorneys in the state. Rebecca had successfully handled cases against major corporations and had a reputation for fighting hard for her clients. But even she seemed surprised by the obstacles they encountered. "I've never seen a defense team respond this aggressively to such a clear-cut case," Rebecca told Jake after receiving the initial response from the defendant's attorneys. "They're not just denying wrongdoing, they're attacking Lucy's character and your motives." The defense response was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. Steinberg and Associates had filed a motion claiming that Lucy was a frequent rule violator who had been repeatedly warned about her behavior. They produced carefully edited security reports that made Lucy's normal childhood activities sound suspicious and dangerous. According to their version of events, Lucy had been loitering around community property for weeks, intimidating other residents, and refusing to comply with reasonable security requests. They claimed that Officer Brennan had tried to de-escalate the situation peacefully, but Lucy had become aggressive and non-compliant, forcing him to use appropriate force to maintain community safety. Jake was stunned by the audacity of these lies. The security reports had been written after the incident, clearly fabricated to justify Brennan's actions. But proving fabrication would require additional investigation and legal motions, all of which would cost time and money. The defense team also filed a motion to dismiss the case based on qualified immunity, arguing that security officers should receive the same legal protections as police officers. They claimed that Brennan had acted within the scope of his authority and couldn't be held personally liable for his actions. Even more disturbing was their attack on Jake's credibility and motives. Steinberg and Associates filed court documents suggesting that Jake was an overprotective guardian who was exploiting his niece's minor injuries for financial gain. They painted him as someone seeking easy money from a tragic misunderstanding. How can they get away with saying these things? Jake asked Rebecca after reading the defense motions. "Unfortunately, they can say almost anything in legal filings," Rebecca explained. "Our job is to prove them wrong with evidence, but that takes time and resources. They're hoping we'll get discouraged and settle for a small amount." The HOA's response was equally manipulative. They filed papers claiming that they had no control over Guardian Protection Services' daily operations and couldn't be held responsible for individual officers' actions. They argued that they had hired a reputable security company and relied on that company to train and supervise their employees properly. Mrs. Patterson, the HOA president, even filed an affidavit expressing her deep concern for Lucy's well-being, while simultaneously arguing that the HOA had acted responsibly throughout the incident. She claimed that the board had immediately launched an internal investigation and was committed to preventing similar incidents in the future. Jake knew this was completely false. The HOA board had not conducted any investigation. In fact, they had initially tried to suppress the doorbell camera footage that proved Brennan's guilt. Mrs. Patterson had called David Park and asked him not to share his video with anyone, claiming it might complicate the situation. Guardian Protection Services filed the most aggressive defense. Their attorneys argued that Officer Brennan had followed proper protocols for dealing with unauthorized individuals in private communities. They claimed that Lucy's presence near the pool without adult supervision violated community safety policies, and that Brennan had the right to remove her using appropriate force. They also filed a counterclaim against Jake, alleging that his interference in the investigation had damaged their business reputation and caused financial losses. They demanded compensation for lost contracts and legal expenses, effectively trying to make Jake pay for the privilege of seeking justice for his niece. The legal maneuvering became increasingly complex and expensive. Every motion filed by the defense required a response from Rebecca, and each response cost thousands of dollars in legal fees. Depositions were scheduled and then canceled. Document requests were filed and then challenged. Simple questions that should have been answered in days stretched into weeks of legal arguments. Jake began to understand that this wasn't really about determining what had happened to Lucy or who was responsible. The defense strategy was to make the legal process so expensive and time-consuming that Jake would eventually give up and accept whatever small settlement they offered. "This is how the system works," Rebecca explained during one of their strategy meetings. "Large institutions have deep pockets and experienced legal teams. They can afford to drag cases out for years, while individual families eventually run out of money and energy." The psychological pressure was enormous. Jake found himself second-guessing his decision to pursue legal action. Was he really helping Lucy by putting her through this process? Would it be better to accept a settlement and try to move on with their lives? Lucy was still struggling with the emotional aftermath of the attack. She'd started having panic attacks when she saw security guards or police officers. She refused to ride her bike anywhere near the pool area. Some nights she woke up screaming from nightmares about being chased and attacked. The legal proceedings made everything worse. Lucy had to give a deposition, answering questions from Brennan's attorney about what had happened. The lawyer tried to confuse her about details and suggested that she might be remembering things incorrectly. After the deposition, Lucy cried for hours and asked Jake why the adults were being so mean to her. Meanwhile, the community was being torn apart by the controversy. Some neighbors supported Jake and Lucy completely, but others worried that the lawsuit was making the neighborhood look bad. Property values were being affected, and some residents blamed Jake for bringing negative attention to Maple Ridge community. The HOA board called a special meeting to discuss the situation. Mrs. Patterson announced that they were hiring a public relations firm to manage the narrative around the incident. They were more concerned about their reputation than about the fact that a child had been attacked in their community. Jake attended the meeting and was shocked by what he heard. Several board members suggested that the incident had been blown out of proportion and that Lucy's injuries weren't as serious as Jake claimed. One member even suggested that families with children might want to consider more appropriate housing options if they couldn't follow community rules. The message was clear. Jake and Lucy weren't welcome in Maple Ridge community anymore. Their search for justice was being treated as a betrayal of their neighbors and community. As the legal battles continued, Jake realized that he was fighting much more than just Officer Brennan or Guardian Protection Services. He was challenging an entire system designed to protect wealthy institutions at the expense of individual victims. The law firm representing the defendants had handled hundreds of similar cases, always with the same strategy: delay, deny, and discourage. But Jake had something they didn't expect: the patience and determination of someone who'd spent 15 years investigating complex federal cases. He wasn't going to be intimidated by legal tricks or discouraged by setbacks. Lucy deserved justice, and he was going to make sure she got it no matter how long it took or how many obstacles they put in his way. After 18 months of legal battles, motions, and delays, the civil trial finally began on a cold Monday morning in February. Judge Harold Whitman's courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and legal observers who had followed the case. The story of a security guard tasing a 12-year-old girl had captured national attention, making this one of the most watched trials in the county's history. Jake sat in the front row behind Rebecca Thompson, his attorney, watching as the jury was seated. 12 ordinary citizens would decide whether Officer Brennan and the institutions that employed him should be held accountable for attacking Lucy. Jake studied their faces, wondering if they had children of their own, if they could imagine their own kids being hurt the way Lucy had been hurt. Lucy sat beside Jake, looking small and nervous in her best dress. She was now 14 years old, but the trauma of that summer day still affected her daily life. She'd agreed to testify about what had happened, but Jake could see her hands shaking as she watched the crowded courtroom fill with strangers. The defense team was impressive and intimidating. Robert Steinberg himself was representing Officer Brennan, along with 2 junior attorneys and a paralegal. Steinberg had a reputation as one of the best defense lawyers in the state, someone who could make juries doubt their own eyes. His expensive suit and confident manner made it clear that Guardian Protection Services was sparing no expense to win this case. Rebecca Thompson looked confident as she prepared her opening statement, but Jake knew she was facing an uphill battle. Steinberg had built his career on defending large corporations and wealthy individuals against personal injury claims. He knew every trick for making victims look like opportunists and turning clear-cut cases into confusing battles of interpretation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rebecca began, "this case is about what happens when adults fail to protect children. 14-year-old Lucy Williams was a happy, healthy girl who loved riding her bike and swimming with friends. On the day she was attacked, she was doing exactly what thousands of children do every summer day, riding her bike to a community pool." Rebecca's opening was powerful and emotional. She described Lucy as a normal kid living a normal life until Officer Brennan decided to treat her like a dangerous criminal. She explained how a simple bike ride to meet friends had turned into a nightmare that continued to affect Lucy's daily life. "The evidence will show that Officer Brennan had no justification for using a taser on this child," Rebecca continued. "Lucy posed no threat to anyone. She was polite, cooperative, and trying to follow his instructions. But instead of treating her like the child she was, Officer Brennan chose violence." When Steinberg stood to give his opening statement, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. His voice was smooth and authoritative, and he spoke like someone who was sharing unfortunate but necessary truths. "Members of the jury, this case is about responsibility and safety," Steinberg began. "Maple Ridge Community is a private residential area where families pay good money to live in a secure environment. When that security is threatened, trained professionals must make difficult decisions to protect everyone." Steinberg's strategy became clear immediately. He wasn't going to deny that Brennan had tased Lucy. Instead, he was going to argue that it was justified and necessary. He painted Officer Brennan as a dedicated security professional who had tried to handle a difficult situation peacefully but was forced to take action when Lucy became non-compliant. "You will hear testimony that Miss Williams had been warned multiple times about her behavior in the community," Steinberg continued. "On the day in question, she refused to follow lawful instructions from a security officer. Officer Brennan exhausted all other options before reluctantly using the minimum force necessary to maintain community safety." Jake felt sick listening to Steinberg twist the facts. The lawyer was describing a completely different incident than what had actually happened. But he spoke with such confidence that Jake worried the jury might start to believe his version of events. The first week of testimony focused on what had happened that day at the pool. Rebecca called Mrs. Chen as her first witness, and the elderly neighbor described exactly what she had seen from her front yard. The child was just sitting on her bicycle, trying to answer the officer's questions, Mrs. Chen testified. She was being very polite, calling him sir and trying to explain that she lived in the neighborhood. But he kept getting angrier and angrier for no reason. Steinberg's cross-examination of Mrs. Chen was aggressive and confusing. He questioned her eyesight, her memory, and her ability to hear what was being said from her position across the street. He suggested that she might be biased in favor of Jake because they were neighbors and friends. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Chen, that you didn't actually hear every word of the conversation between Officer Brennan and Miss Williams?" Steinberg asked. I heard enough to know that little girl wasn't doing anything wrong, Mrs. Chen replied firmly. Tommy's dad, Mike Rodriguez, testified about witnessing the incident while walking to the pool with his own children. His testimony was powerful because he described how his kids had reacted to seeing Lucy being attacked. My 7-year-old daughter started crying and asked me why the policeman was hurting Lucy, Mike testified. How do you explain to a child that an adult whose job is to keep people safe just attacked their friend for no reason? The most dramatic moment of the first week came when Rebecca played the doorbell camera footage for the jury. The courtroom was completely silent as everyone watched Lucy riding her bike normally, being confronted by Officer Brennan, and then being tased without warning. Several jury members looked shocked and disgusted as they watched the attack unfold, but Steinberg was ready for the video evidence. During his cross-examination of David Park, the neighbor who had provided the footage, he focused on technical details about camera angles and audio quality. He suggested that the video didn't show everything, and that important context might be missing. Mr. Park, this camera system cost several $1,000s, didn't it? Steinberg asked. Yes, but I don't see what that has to do with anything, David replied. Someone who invests that much money in surveillance equipment might be particularly interested in creating drama and conflict in the neighborhood. Wouldn't you agree? Rebecca objected to the question as irrelevant, but Steinberg had planted a seed of doubt about David's motives for recording the incident. The second week of testimony focused on Lucy's injuries and the long-term effects of the attack. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the emergency room physician who had treated Lucy, testified about the dangers of using tasers on children. Electrical weapons can cause serious injury or death when used on young people, Dr. Hayes explained. Children's smaller body mass and developing nervous systems make them particularly vulnerable to electrical shock. The jury listened carefully as Dr. Hayes described Lucy's physical injuries and the ongoing medical monitoring she'd required. But the emotional impact was even more powerful when Lucy's therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, testified about the psychological trauma. Lucy has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of this incident, Dr. Martinez explained. She experiences panic attacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety around authority figures. The attack has fundamentally changed how she views the world and her safety in it. Steinberg's cross-examination of the medical witnesses was brutal. He questioned every diagnosis, suggested that Lucy's symptoms might be exaggerated, and implied that her problems might have existed before the incident. He was particularly aggressive with Dr. Martinez, suggesting that Lucy had been coached to describe certain symptoms. The most difficult day for Jake was when Lucy had to testify. Rebecca had prepared her carefully, but nothing could have made it easy for a 14-year-old to describe being attacked while dozens of strangers watched and took notes. I was just trying to go swimming with my friends, Lucy said quietly when Rebecca asked her to describe what had happened. I didn't understand why Officer Brennan was so angry with me. I kept trying to tell him that I lived there, but he wouldn't listen. Lucy's voice got smaller as she described the moment when Brennan pulled out his taser. I didn't know what it was at first. Then I felt like lightning hit me and I couldn't control my body. I fell down and couldn't stop shaking. The courtroom was completely silent as Lucy described her injuries and how they'd affected her life. She talked about being afraid to ride her bike, having nightmares about being chased and feeling scared whenever she saw police officers or security guards. Steinberg's cross-examination of Lucy was the most disturbing part of the entire trial. He questioned her memory of events, suggested that she might be confusing details, and implied that her ongoing problems were her own fault for not moving on from the incident. Miss Williams, isn't it true that you'd been warned before about following community rules? Steinberg asked. No, sir, Lucy replied. I always followed the rules. But you admit that you were in the pool area without adult supervision, which violates community safety policies. I went to the pool by myself lots of times. All the kids did. Nobody ever said it was against the rules. The third week of the trial began with Officer Brennan taking the stand in his own defense. Steinberg had coached him well, and Brennan appeared calm and professional as he described his version of events. He wore a conservative suit and spoke in measured tones, trying to project the image of a responsible security officer who had been forced to make a difficult decision. I approached Miss Williams because she appeared to be loitering in a restricted area without proper supervision, Brennan testified. When I attempted to verify her authorization to be in the community, she became evasive and non-compliant with my reasonable requests. Brennan's testimony was carefully crafted to make his actions sound justified and professional. He claimed that Lucy had been aggressive and threatening during their interaction, forcing him to escalate his response to maintain community safety. I exhausted all de-escalation techniques before deploying my taser, Brennan continued. Miss Williams was refusing to comply with lawful orders and appeared to be preparing to flee the scene. I had to make a split-second decision to prevent a potentially dangerous situation from escalating further. Jake listened to this complete fabrication of the truth and struggled to control his anger. Every word Brennan spoke was a lie, but he delivered his testimony with such conviction that Jake worried some jury members might believe him. Steinberg's direct examination of Brennan lasted 2 full days, during which they carefully constructed a narrative that portrayed the security officer as a dedicated professional who had followed proper protocols. They discussed Brennan's training, his experience in security work, and his commitment to keeping communities safe. Mr. Brennan, do you take any pleasure in having to use force as part of your security duties? Steinberg asked. Absolutely not, Brennan replied, looking directly at the jury. Using force is always a last resort. I have children of my own, and I understand how difficult this situation has been for everyone involved. When Rebecca Thompson stood up for cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. She had been waiting for this moment for months, and Jake could see the controlled intensity in her demeanor as she approached the witness stand. Mr. Brennan, you testified that Lucy Williams appeared to be loitering when you first saw her. Can you explain exactly what suspicious behavior you observed? She was lingering in the pool area without apparent purpose, Brennan replied. She was riding her bike on a public sidewalk toward the community pool where her friends were waiting. Is that what you consider suspicious behavior? Children in private communities are required to be supervised by adults at all times. Rebecca pulled out a copy of the community rules and regulations. Can you point to the specific rule that prohibits children from riding bikes to the pool area? Brennan fumbled through the document but couldn't find any such rule. Rebecca pressed harder, forcing him to admit that no written policy prohibited Lucy's activities. Mr. Brennan, you testified that Lucy became aggressive during your interaction. Can you describe specifically what aggressive actions she took? She refused to comply with my instructions to leave the area immediately. She was crying and trying to explain that she lived in the community. Is that what you consider aggressive behavior? As Rebecca's cross-examination continued, cracks began to appear in Brennan's testimony. He contradicted himself on several key details and couldn't explain why he hadn't called for backup or attempted other de-escalation techniques before using his taser. The most damaging moment came when Rebecca confronted Brennan with his training records, showing that he had never completed the required certification course for taser use. Mr. Brennan, were you legally authorized to carry a taser on the day you attacked Lucy Williams? Steinberg objected to the use of the word attacked, but the damage was done. Brennan had to admit that he'd been carrying and using a weapon he wasn't properly trained to operate. After Brennan's testimony, Steinberg called several character witnesses who described the security officer as a responsible family man and dedicated professional. But their testimony felt hollow after Rebecca's devastating cross-examination had exposed the lies in Brennan's story. The final witness for the defense was Mrs. Patterson, the HOA president. She testified about the board's decision to hire guardian protection services and their efforts to maintain a safe community environment. Steinberg used her testimony to argue that the HOA had acted responsibly and couldn't be held liable for Brennan's individual actions. During the closing arguments, Steinberg made one final attempt to confuse the jury and minimize the defendant's responsibility. He argued that the incident had been a tragic misunderstanding, not a deliberate attack on an innocent child. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Brennan is not a monster, Steinberg told the jury. He's a hard-working security professional who made a difficult decision under challenging circumstances. While we all sympathize with Miss Williams and her family, we cannot hold Mr. Brennan liable for following his training and protecting the community. Rebecca's closing argument was passionate and direct. She reminded the jury of the video evidence showing Lucy's innocence and Brennan's unprovoked aggression. She described the lasting trauma that Lucy continued to experience and challenged the jury to hold the defendants accountable for their actions. "This case is about more than money," Rebecca told the jury. "It's about whether we're going to allow adults in positions of authority to attack children without consequences." Lucy Williams was doing nothing wrong when Officer Brennan chose to use a dangerous weapon against her. No child should have to fear being hurt by the very people who are supposed to protect them. As Rebecca delivered her closing argument, Jake felt a mix of pride and anxiety. She had done an excellent job presenting their case, but he knew that juries could be unpredictable. Steinberg was an experienced attorney who had successfully defended other seemingly indefensible cases. The judge gave his instructions to the jury, explaining the legal standards they needed to apply when determining liability and damages. Jake watched the 12 jurors file out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations, knowing that Lucy's future, and his faith in the justice system, hung in the balance. During the break in proceedings, Jake stepped outside the courtroom to call Lucy, who had returned to school while the closing arguments were being presented. As he walked through the hallway, he noticed several reporters trying to get statements from the attorneys and witnesses. "Mr. Williams," one reporter called out, "can you comment on how this case has affected your family?" Jake had been careful throughout the trial to let Rebecca handle all media interactions, but something about the reporter's question made him stop. For 18 months, he'd watched the defense team attack Lucy's character and question his motives. He'd listened to lies and distortions without being able to respond directly. "This case is about protecting children," Jake said simply. "My niece was attacked for riding her bike to a swimming pool. That should never happen to any child anywhere." As Jake spoke to the reporter, he felt his FBI credentials shift in his jacket pocket. Throughout the trial, he'd deliberately kept his law enforcement background private, not wanting to influence the jury's decision. Rebecca had argued that his profession wasn't relevant to the case, and Judge Whitman had agreed to keep it out of the testimony. But as Jake returned to the courtroom for what he hoped would be the jury's verdict, he realized that his decision to hide his FBI career might have been a mistake. The defense had spent months portraying him as an ordinary citizen, seeking easy money from a tragic accident. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who understood exactly how the system worked, and had the skills and determination to fight back against institutional corruption. The bailiff announced that the jury was ready to return to the courtroom. As Jake took his seat behind Rebecca, he could feel the weight of his credentials in his jacket pocket. Soon, he thought, everyone would understand exactly who they'd been dealing with, and why attacking his niece had been the worst mistake Officer Brennan and his employers could have made. The jury deliberated for 3.5 hours before sending word that they had reached a verdict. As everyone filed back into the packed courtroom, Jake could feel the tension in the air. 18 months of legal battles, thousands of dollars in expenses, and countless hours of stress all came down to this moment. Lucy had returned from school and sat beside Jake, holding his hand tightly. At 14, she understood the importance of what was happening. This wasn't just about money. It was about whether the adults who had hurt her would face any consequences for their actions. Judge Whitman called the court to order and asked the jury foreman to read the verdict. The courtroom was completely silent as the foreman, a middle-aged teacher named Robert Chen, stood with the verdict form in his hands. In the case of Williams versus Brennan, Guardian Protection Services, and Maple Ridge Community Association, we the jury find the defendants liable for assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligent supervision. Jake felt relief wash over him as the foreman continued reading. The jury had seen through Steinberg's manipulation and lies. They understood that Lucy was an innocent victim who had been attacked without justification. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $800,000 for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and emotional distress. We award punitive damages in the amount of $1.5 million, for a total judgment of $2.3 million. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. It was one of the largest personal injury awards in the county's history, and it sent a clear message that the jury was outraged by what had happened to Lucy. Steinberg immediately stood up and announced his intention to appeal the verdict, but Jake could see the defeat in his eyes. The defense had expected a much different outcome, possibly even a complete victory. Instead, they faced a massive judgment that would likely bankrupt Guardian Protection Services and force significant changes to HOA security policies. As reporters rushed to interview the attorneys and court officials cleared the courtroom, Jake noticed something happening that he hadn't expected. Several jury members approached him and Lucy as they prepared to leave. "I just want you to know how brave your niece is," said Margaret Foster, a grandmother who had served as one of the jurors. "What that man did to her was inexcusable, and I'm glad we could help make it right." Another juror, a father of 2 young children, shook Jake's hand and said, "No child should ever have to go through what Lucy experienced. I hope this verdict helps her heal and prevents other kids from being hurt." As Jake thanked the jurors for their service, he felt his FBI credentials shift in his jacket pocket. Throughout the trial, he'd kept his law enforcement background hidden, letting the case stand on its own merits. But as he stood to leave the courtroom, something unexpected happened. Judge Whitman called Jake back to the bench for a brief conference about post-trial procedures. As Jake rose quickly from his seat, his FBI credentials slipped from his jacket pocket and clattered loudly onto the marble floor of the courtroom. The black leather case fell open, revealing the distinctive gold FBI badge and federal identification card. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with post-verdict conversations, suddenly fell silent. Reporters, attorneys, and spectators all stared at the credentials lying on the floor. Judge Whitman's eyebrows raised as he looked from the badge to Jake. "Mr. Williams, I wasn't aware of your professional background." Steinberg, who had been packing his briefcase in defeat, looked up and saw the FBI credentials. His face went pale as he realized that for 18 months, he'd been attacking the credibility and motives of a federal law enforcement officer. "Your Honor," Jake said, picking up his credentials and standing respectfully before the bench, "I kept my career private throughout this case because I wanted the jury to focus on what happened to Lucy, not on my profession." Judge Whitman nodded approvingly. "That was appropriate, Mr. Williams, but I have to say, it explains a great deal about the quality of the investigation and evidence in this case." As word spread through the courtroom about Jake's FBI career, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Reporters who had been preparing to leave suddenly started taking notes furiously. Brennan, who had been sitting smugly throughout the verdict, now looked terrified as he realized the full implications of what he'd done. The revelation of Jake's federal law enforcement background added a new dimension to the story that quickly spread beyond the courtroom. Within hours, national news outlets were reporting on the FBI agent whose niece had been attacked by a security guard and how he'd methodically built a case that resulted in a multi-million-dollar judgment. But for Jake, the most important moment came later that evening, when he and Lucy were finally alone at home. She had been quiet during the drive back from the courthouse, processing everything that had happened. "Uncle Jake," Lucy said as they sat together on the couch, "does this mean it's really over?" "The court case is over," Jake replied carefully. "But healing takes time. How are you feeling about everything?" Lucy was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad the jury believed me. For a long time I was worried that people thought I was lying or that I had done something wrong." Jake put his arm around his niece and pulled her close. "You never did anything wrong, Lucy. What happened to you was completely unfair, and I'm proud of how brave you've been throughout this whole process." Over the following weeks, the impact of the verdict became clear. Guardian Protection Services filed for bankruptcy within a month, unable to pay the judgment and facing several other lawsuits from victims of their security officers. Officer Brennan lost his security license permanently and faced criminal charges that would likely result in prison time. The HOA underwent a complete transformation. Mrs. Patterson and the entire board resigned in disgrace, replaced by new leadership committed to transparency and accountability. The new board implemented strict policies governing security operations and created a community oversight committee to prevent future abuses. Most importantly, Lucy began to heal. The verdict had validated her experience and held her attackers accountable, which helped her start to trust the world again. She returned to riding her bike. Though she still felt nervous around security guards and police officers, Jake used his share of the legal victory to establish a foundation dedicated to protecting children from security and law enforcement abuses. The foundation provided legal assistance to families who couldn't afford to fight institutional corruption and lobbied for stronger regulations on private security companies. The case also led to significant legislative changes. The state passed new laws requiring better training for security officers, stricter oversight of private security companies, and clearer limitations on the use of force against minors. Other states followed suit, creating a national movement to protect children from security abuses. 3 years after the attack, Lucy was a confident 17-year-old who had largely overcome her trauma. She testified before the state legislature in support of security reform legislation, becoming a powerful advocate for children's safety. "What happened to me was terrible," Lucy told the legislators. "But if my experience can prevent other kids from being hurt, then something good came from something bad." Jake watched his niece testify with pride and amazement. The scared 12-year-old who had been attacked for riding her bike had become a strong young woman who was helping to protect other children. Her courage in facing her attackers and fighting for justice had created changes that would benefit families across the country. The empty lot where Maple Ridge Community's pool used to be now hosted a small park with a playground and walking trails. The community had voted to remove the pool and create a space where children could play freely without fear of being watched or harassed by security guards. On the anniversary of Lucy's attack, Jake and Lucy visited the park together. A small plaque near the playground read, "Dedicated to the safety and happiness of all children. May they always feel protected in their own communities." As they walked through the park, watching children play and laugh without fear, Jake reflected on everything they'd been through. The legal victory had been important, but the real success was seeing Lucy healthy and happy again, and knowing that their fight had made the world a little bit safer for other children. The case had taught Jake that justice sometimes requires patience, determination, and the courage to fight against powerful institutions that seem impossible to defeat. But it had also shown him that ordinary people, when armed with truth and persistence, could create extraordinary change. Lucy's attack had been a tragedy that no child should ever experience. But her recovery, their legal victory, and the reforms that followed proved that even the worst injustices could be transformed into forces for positive change. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it can change everything.